Just want to throw one thought out there is that I don't see gorillas on covers anymore.
Damn shame.
Oh, thank God. I mean, yeah, that's too bad.
Especially purple ones.
Classic comics, the classic comics forum and depth, snappy conversations with your hosts George and Jeff. Oh, classic comics, the classic comics forum and depth, talking about old comic books is the thing that they love the best.
It's a CCF in depth,
Hello, everybody. I'm George.
and I'm still Jeff.
And I'm Ed.
And we have Ed with us today. Welcome, Ed.
Thank you very much.
Today's episode, we have summoned the great Ed O'Toole to help us with a new topic today. We are talking about DC's transformation in the late 1960s and early 1970s under the watch and influence of Carmine and Infantino. Holy gosh, I said that completely wrong. Carmine, right?
Carmine.
Carmine.
Carmine is fine. How did you say it?
I said Carmine.
Or maybe you're from France or something.
Could be. Today we are talking about Carmine Infantino's influence on DC Comics in the late 1960s, from 1966 up through 1971. He played an important role even beyond that, but those are years we're focusing on today because Ed said so. And that works for me. So
We don't want this to be a mini series.
right. So Ed, start us off if you wouldn't mind. Just a general overview. What's special about this time period and why is it worthy of our discussion?
Well, I think I'm probably like a lot of fans of comics or any popular culture. You associate a time when you were young, often with whatever was going on in the culture. And I had started reading comics in 1962, and I would occasionally be able to buy comics, but I was a little kid, so I didn't, go down to the store and buy 10 comics at a shot. Didn't have that kind of money, didn't have that kind of access. As time goes by, I loved them, and I especially loved DC. Not that I didn't like other comics, but there just seemed to be more DC on the stands, and you couldn't get too many of the Marvels, for instance. You just didn't see them that often. Anyway,
That's because the fix was in.
oh, it definitely was in. And there were some guys who find things that fall off the back of trucks who were involved in the distribution system, if you know what I mean. In any event, when the changes happened at DC, which I didn't know, of course, as a young fan, as a kid, that Carmine Infantino was responsible, or at least in charge of DC when these were going on. I was also getting a little bit more independence. I had a little bit more money in my pocket. I was very lucky because I went to high school in Newark, New Jersey, and I had to take public transportation to get there. And my mom, being the wonderful angel she was, said to me the day before I started school, she said, "Look, I'm going to give you this money so you have it in case anything ever happens." And she reached over to me and gave me what she dubbed my emergency dollar.
And quote unquote, something happened.
And and I looked at that dollar and I said, "Yeah, I'm not going to get in any trouble where I'm going to need this buck. I'm going to find some comic book stores around the high school." And long story short, 1967, I start high school. 1968 really represents a big change in comics because Marvel got the distribution contract changed. They could put more titles out there. DC was already running a little bit scared of Marvel. And suddenly it was a time that, oh my God, there were just so many comics on the stands. And I had access to them finally, because as I said, distribution was helter-skelter in those days. And the more what we called candy stores that were around, the better chance you had to find new comics.
What an exciting era
Oh,
it was.
yeah.
I wish I'd been around for it. Truly.
Well, it really was great. And as I said, everybody talks about the thrill of the hunt for their comics. And in those days, the hunt involved long walks and finding new stores and hoping that you would get there on time and waiting for the guy to undo the bundle sometimes. And of course, comics were not the popular um, art form, so to speak, that they are today. You couldn't just walk around and say, "Yeah, I'm reading comics." you get your head handed to you.
Yeah, you could if you wanted to get beat up.
Yeah. And it always ticked me off because, the comic book just didn't quite fit inside the back of a spiral notebook. So that, and I was not a book bag kid because you get beat up if you had a book bag, for crying out loud. And so you had to discuss. This was a love that dare not speak its name in those days.
This is wild. You had to hide. You had to hide your comics from the bullies, and you also had to hide it from your mom to see that you didn't squander the buck.
Oh, without a doubt, without a doubt. And my mother would replenish the dollar every so often, not as often as I liked. I'd lie for a couple of weeks and say, no, I'm fine. But and plus
Mom,
my
I
mother,
got an emergency. Mom, it's quick. 911.
yeah. And my mother was not thrilled all the time with the idea that I was, quote unquote, wasting my money on comic books. So I didn't want to emphasize the fact that I was, had a little space under my bed or in the bottom of my closet that was slowly filling up with, issues of Star Spangled War stories.
And the beautiful irony in all this is that clearly you were not the only one hiding these in your book bags and spiral notebooks, because there was a huge market DC and Marvel were vying for that wasn't coming from nowhere.
I know, and I was envious of all these kids who would write into the letters pages and say, my pals and I have a comic book club. I'd say, wow, those are gutsy kids. How do you go up to somebody and say, hey, want to start a comic book club? Jeez.
Right.
It would not have been easy. And I will say, and this might be a topic later on as we're talking about the effects of this time period. I was able to come out of the comic closet, so to speak, before I finished high school, believe it or not.
How'd you do that?
Well, part of the effect of the changes in the comics at both DC and Marvel was that they were getting some attention in the newspapers and on television. And remember, now this is coming right after the whole Batmania phenomenon. So that comics really took it on the chin then. You'd be saying, oh, no, they're really not like that all the time, the way you saw them on Adam West. But by 1970, 71, because you had this influx of younger artists, younger writers, suddenly there was a change in comics and they shifted to be more reality based, or at least for comic books anyway, they were more reality based. So you had all these current events playing into them. And my senior year in high school, 1971, the New York Times had a front page article, a front cover article, and a big story on Sergeant Rock and the relevance in comics, because they did a My Lai takeoff essentially in Sergeant Rock with a soldier massacring civilians. And this was pretty radical. And comics were definitely then sticking their head out of the sand, so to speak, and saying we're not just for kids. So if at that point I had trusted friends, and I vividly remember we were all involved in our school newspaper, and in my senior year we went over to Columbia University for some big, huge convention of high school newspaper kids, and there were speakers and all this sort of thing. And on the way over, I was just desperate, because I'm saying to my friends, hey, we got to there's a candy store on the way, we got to stop. What do we stop here for it? And my friend Murph was driving. Murph said, what are we stopping here for? And I said, please. And my other friend said, Ed wants a comic book. I know that's what it is. And you go into this new territory, and suddenly I'd say, oh, there's one. I jump out of the car. I picked up the only copy I ever saw on the stands of the Green Lantern, Green Arrow series, in which Spiro Agnew was the main villain, or a guy who looked like Spiro Agnew. I come back in. They said, well, I hope it was worth it. I said, look at this, you guys. Look at this. And so couple of my friends were mildly impressed, in the sense that they said, oh, well, okay, so it's not just, up and away Superman beating up some alien. And I said, no, this is serious stuff, okay? So
wow.
It worked out well.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Jeff.
I wish YouTube had been around back then, just seeing reaction takes for people who were expecting, Bao, Biff, Sock, and saw Speedy shooting up with a heroin needle in his arm on Green Lantern, Green Arrow. It must have been incredible.
Yes.
Those are great times.
Good times, Speedy. No, it was. And as listen, I was 14, 15, 16, 17 years old. So I'm not opening these, with the same maturity, so to speak, that I would if I I were reading them now. Now some of them look very self-conscious, kind of silly, pretentious, whatever. But this was so new, and it was a great way, really, to reach out to a younger audience. Let's face it.
Absolutely. So let's dial back a bit to the
Sure.
beginning of this change and set the stage a bit. It's 1966. DC is coming off the strength of the new Batman television series, but at the same time, they're starting to feel the heat from Marvel. Um, Ed, as somebody who was there at the time, what wasn't working at DC that needed fixing or tweaking or revisiting?
Well, the odd thing about DC was that if you were reading Marvel and DC, you could find a niche at DC that seemed a little bit like Marvel. And I speak here of things like Doom Patrol, uh, Metamorpho, which were irreverent in their style, in their artwork. They were different, but they were irreverent about comics. It was almost there was a little meta aspect to those comics, which you kind of saw over at Marvel. But for the most part, DC was like several different little companies, and each one had its unique style. And the main ones, of course, in that time were Superman and Batman. And Weisinger had complete control of the Superman line. And Batman had nearly collapsed, which, precipitated the need for the new look in '64. And then DC and Batman comics had the sugar high of the Batmania era, and that just dropped off the edge of the table, so to speak, and very, very quickly. So they saw that Marvel at that time was getting a lot of PR about the fact that there were college kids, and I use all capital letters for that, college kids reading comics. And as a young comics reader at the time, I'm wicked impressed when I read a letter and he says, I'm a student at East Jabip Community College. I'm going, wow, he's a college kid reading this. Or somebody I remember very distinctly Irene Vardanoff, who was always writing to the Julie Schwartz edited comics. And she commented on a reference to Shakespeare in in the very first Riddler story since the Golden Age. And she's writing about this. I'm going, oh my gosh. There were two stories in that comic. The one story had references to Othello, Jeff.
Nice.
And the main villain was Victor Iago. And of course, I didn't know what that was. But then Irene writes, and I'm going, oh my God, there's so much here. And it was pretty fascinating. But Marvel was getting all that play because they were popular on the college campuses. Kids were still reading them. And suddenly DC realizes, you know what? The Weisinger model of the kids stick around for a few years, but they're gone by the time they're 12 just doesn't seem to be working anymore. Mort Weisinger, in his letters pages, referred to Marvel as brand I and had all these snarky remarks about them and encouraged readers to write in and talk about how bad brand I was as opposed to DC, which was, they were the Cadillac, so to speak, of the industry.
Well, Mort Weisinger was known for being a son of a gun that nobody liked. Not even his kids liked them.
Yeah, yeah.
So he's putting there that's tantamount to whistling in the dark, because you can hear the footsteps coming from Marvel.
Right.
And a big difference was not the 13-year-old or whatever. The difference was DC was plot driven, and Marvel was character driven. And you'll come back for a character even if the story is not good. But if the plot is not good, you're out.
Yeah, there were no continued stories really at DC. Nothing on the scope of what Marvel did for a long time there. There were, chapters. They were melodramatic. They were like soap operas. And as you said, George, you got hooked by the characters. And you could pick up a Batman story from '64 or '5, and even a New Look story from '67 or '68, and you'd say, well, basically the formula's the same. The art might be a little slicker, and his costume has that yellow symbol behind the yellow color behind the bat symbol. But in many ways, the characters didn't change, and
Marvel had the illusion of change.
Yes,
even if they didn't change. Although I argue with that too, because they did change. People got married, people had kids. People graduated from high school, so there was change.
Yeah,
but they changed it just a little bit, so that you can keep coming back for the soap opera aspect.
Right.
To go back to the Cadillac idea as well, a big issue with DC in 1966 is it wasn't just standing still, it was defiantly standing still. Where Infantino has pointed out the fact that all the major editors of the time period, specifically Schwartz, Boltinoff, Weisinger, all came out of the pulps. That was where they started, and they weren't really looking to innovate or change beyond that. It was a business, they learned the rules, and they were going to keep things that had always worked going the way they always had. And Orlando pointed out the fact that each one of those editors, actually I have the quote, I'll read it right here. Every editor for some reason had acquired a clone, the freelance writer who got the most work out of that editor. That writer acquired a lot of authority and could influence the editor as to whether you worked or not, sometimes acting as editor. I think it became a very exclusive club that after time was not meeting the market needs. It essentially became a self-serving machine that wasn't looking to innovate or do anything different whatsoever.
Right. And I don't think, right. They didn't need to. They pretty much had everything to themselves. And then along comes Marvel. And Weisinger, I will say this, though, there are little kind of gems in there hidden away. Like, for instance, it was Weisinger who worked with Jim Shooter. And whatever you think about Jim Shooter, he's 13 years old. He takes a lot of what he was getting out of reading Marvel and brings it over to Adventure Comics and the Legion. And suddenly the Legion, which I had always read as a kid, suddenly you're saying, oh, wow, these are really people with personalities as opposed to just interchangeable people in uniforms.
What happened with Jim Shooter is that when he was young, he was very sick. And what he did is he actually bought Marvel comic books and kept reading them and analyzing them to see what was the difference between a Marvel comic and a DC comic. This is before Weisinger. So he walked in, and when he started submitting stories that were accepted and published, it's because they were not like a DC comic. They were closer to being a Marvel comic book.
Right.
And that they needed that change.
I actually applaud Weisinger for doing that. He strikes you as the kind of guy who would just dismiss that sort of thing. But the kid came in, and I know he came from a very poor background, if I'm not mistaken. So this was really a godsend for him. And Weisinger, to his credit, took him under his wing, so to speak, and helped him along. And but the kid came to him and said, "Listen, this is what you should be doing with that particular comic, at least."
Right. You know, DC had no clue. They thought that the reason Marvel was selling comic books was because the art was bad. I mean, they literally would have meetings and say, look, this must be it.
Yeah.
Look how bad this drawing is.
Yeah.
Which is outrageous. They would talk about Jack Kirby drawings at the peak of his power.
Yeah.
So they really had no clue. And they also had a bunch of fiefdoms. You mentioned Weisinger and the other people running their Batman line, the Superman line. You couldn't tell them a thing.
No.
You couldn't tell them a thing. They would not change anything.
Well, they'd been there since dirt was new. And really, and I guess in many ways, comics really hadn't changed much. And they'd almost, Marvel had almost collapsed when they were Atlas. And they really had the place themselves. And they didn't bother going into the areas like the Dell comics. There were comics, obviously, for younger kids, but not to the same extent that they had them at those other companies. And Marvel, smacked them. They really did.
Sometimes you need a wake-up call.
So speaking of wake-up calls, the beginning of that change seems to be Irwin Donenfeld, who, even though he'd been in charge of DC since 1952, I'm not quite sure what clicked in 1966 per se, or if he'd been doing new things all along. But I know by this point, he's starting to look at cover appeal. He's starting to realize that art sells a book. The gorilla covers we mentioned before we started recording this, that he'd figured out every time there's a gorilla on a cover, it sells better. So put gorillas in every story. Yeah. And then at a certain point, he realizes that Infantino's covers are always selling better than issues that don't have Infantino covers. So he starts drafting Infantino to do the cover first and then have the writer write the story around it. It starts with, I think, one or two franchises and then sort of just expands out organically over time to the point that eventually Infantino is basically directing not necessarily writing, or rather not necessarily drawing each cover, but at least doing a sketch or a proof of how each cover should look for the entire line at a certain point.
Yeah. And when you read about this, you're never sure whom to believe when you're reading about comic book history. And Infantino says that Marvel made him an offer to come over and work for them. And he brought it back to Donenfeld, and Donenfeld said, "Well, we'll give you a little bit more money, and we'll also make you the quote unquote art director." And then that kind of segued very quickly into editorial director, and he became involved more in the as well in the direction of the comics and so forth. I mean, it's obviously the truth is somewhere in there. The point is that, as you said, Infantino was sort of the guy the go-to guy on covers. And there were a lot of DC covers that were great. And I know as a kid, and this is all, again, perception. This is like not having the stats in front of you in baseball, but the eye test. Marvel comics looked gray at times. They weren't printed, it seemed, on as good a piece of newsprint, if you will, as DC Comics were. And Charlton was, at the bottom of the heap. I don't know what they were printed on, like paper towel rolls or something. But Infantino got to influence the look of the whole company. And then with the change, with the sale of DC to Kinney and then eventually to Warner Brothers, he was appointed editorial director. And
he rose pretty quick. I just want to add one thing to the cover. We say he became like the cover director. He said that many times he would draw a cover, and they would make a story around the drawing.
Right.
There was no story yet. It was just a cover.
That was a Schwartz specialty. He would have these covers drawn, and he'd call in the writer and go, "Give me a story."
But no writer credit. So someone owes Stan Lee an apology or whatever.
Well, Schwartz, what Schwartz used to do, and I don't know offhand which year this began, but he had several for a couple of years there. He would give the original art to the best letter writer of the issue and or the script.
Wow.
So there were people out there.
And it was worse than that. They said they used to take the original art and cut it into pieces and give it to people that were visiting.
Oh,
so you get this panel, you get panel 5. It's outrageous.
Yeah.
But I mean, back then they said that they didn't care about the art return. They didn't realize it was money yet.
I know. You feel for these guys too, because sometimes I say to myself, these guys, many of them did really fine work, and they had to know that, like, where is this all going? It's going into the ash heap. During the Golden Age in particular, let's get those comics and collect them. And even then, they were disposable items. Nobody ever thought of collecting them in that way, and certainly not saving the art. Jeez,
it wasn't a thing yet. Even collecting comic wasn't a thing. There was no bag boards. There's nothing like that.
And if you look at the transition of consciousness that's happening in the industry at this point, DC is just at this point beginning to comprehend the idea that the visuals matter. It's such a strange thing to say when you're talking about sequential art, but it's really just this point that Donenfeld and then empowering Infantino to do this realizes, oh my gosh, art actually matters to the people buying these comics. So of course the original artwork wouldn't have seemed any more important to them than the original scripts.
Just part of the disposable, just one more consumable item, so to speak.
Right.
But Jeff, what I'm trying to say is that the artists themselves didn't want the art back. They were like, what do I care? I got paid.
Right. It wasn't collectible. There was no money to be made from it.
Yeah, where would they store it? It became an issue. It was like, well, what do I care? I got paid.
And let's not forget too, when you're dealing with, first generation creators at DC as well, they didn't necessarily even see what they were doing as something to be proud of. This was a relatively shameful industry that you paid your dues in before you get into advertising.
Yeah,
right.
I forget. Oh, now it escapes me who I was reading about a few weeks ago who said, I never even I tried not to tell my neighbors what I did. I might have even been Kirby. Might have even been Kirby, who, he said, well, I didn't really want to say what I was doing because people would look down on you for it. And you were home all day working. It was kind of they probably questioned if you were actually working or not, or whether you're doing something illegal in your cellar or what.
I've always wondered about that because Kirby was such a tough guy. And he's, if you were worried, Ed, about being seen buying a comic book, he's making them.
I know.
So 1967, the Kinney company ends up buying DC. Donenfeld is let go pretty soon afterwards. Now Infantino is editorial director. By 1971, he's publisher. And this is where we start seeing these major changes happen at DC. And to ascribe them all to Infantino would be unfair and incorrect, but certainly DC transformed significantly under his editorial control. And I know, Ed, a big part you wanted to talk about is him empowering artists as editors.
In some respects, I say to myself, I'm always looking for it to be kind of a story. And part of the story with Infantino is, hey, all his life he'd been an editor, excuse me, an artist, and now he has a chance to sit in the editor's chair and say, all these years you've been you've been telling us what to do as the artists, and of course we're such a crucial part of making these things popular and saleable. And suddenly he gets to sit in that chair, and what does he do? He says, it's the artists that I'm going to give some free reign here. This is a visual medium. I need artists. And he goes out and kind of restocks the pond, if you will. Weisinger sort of drifted out by himself. I don't know whether he saw the writing on the wall or was just finished. But I would have thought of him as a major obstacle, but he left. And he reaches out and he realizes that over at Charlton, for instance, he's got Dick Giordano. He plucks Orlando, whom he remembers from the EC days. And Sikowski, whom a lot of people never cared for as an artist. If you read the old letters pages and you listen to people today, they didn't care for a lot of his artwork, particularly on Justice League, and I understand. But he gives him an editorship, and he was the fellow in charge of Wonder Woman and changing all that. Obviously not completely by himself, but you get it. And you're right, Infantino. He said, I have no, this is the funny thing. As an artist, you couldn't have asked for a better person to be art director. But as he goes further up the ladder, being having the full reign of the place, that wasn't necessarily in his skill set. But so understanding the sales, understanding what was selling and why, that was a little bit beyond his ken. So he threw everything up against the wall to see what would stick, which was actually, in so many ways, a great result for comics fans.
Ed, I'm sorry, I have to dispute a couple of things you're saying there. Mm-hmm. What I'm understanding from what the research I've done is that he was trained by plenty of people about sales. He said he was taken around. Might have been Donenfeld. He was good friends with one of them. I forget the name.
I think you're right. I think
vacation together. Yep. So he was being trained in the same way Weisinger was training like Shooter. He would take him out. He would show him things. He knew how to read sales reports. He knew how to do all that. He knew what worked. I mean, I guess, he was in charge, so he had to do it his way, but he wasn't doing it totally out of ignorance. He did get some training. Now, you say something about throwing it against the wall. I mean, what else you going to do? Marvel, you can hear the footsteps on Marvel.
Yeah.
You had to do something.
And to be fair,
later on, we could talk about how he got dismissed, but that has something to do with it, the competition with Marvel.
When DC ran into issues with where they raised the prices, this was in 70 or 71, something along those lines. Now, see, and again, I'm going by what Infantino said. He said that he didn't find out about the books going from 32 to 48 pages because that was the independent news dealers' arrangement. They made that decision, and he said he didn't find out about this until he left the company, but they were charging more for their brokerage fee. Everybody else in the industry was paying 10, but we were paying 12.5%, which really, he said, cut into the profit margin. So I don't know where the truth lies there. Obviously, the deal was made. Whether he was unaware of it, not a good thing, or whether he didn't understand it, also not a good thing. But he's doing his best, I think, to explain why DC took the hit there. Because Marvel went to 20 cents, and suddenly the Marvel sales went back up again, and were going better than DC. So I don't know. I just think he was probably in over his head as a publisher, and maybe as editorial director to an extent, whereas he was really in his element as the art director. That's all.
And one has to ask, honestly, who, pardon me, if anyone else could have done better. DC had been stagnant for so long, and Infantino, for better or for worse, is at least trying new things while the market is changing all around him. And I know some of his good ideas, the expanding out the line to new genres. Some of that came from Donenfeld. For example, the venturing into mystery and horror titles. Infantino, in an interview, actually says that was Donenfield's call. It just ended up happening after he was gone. But what I do think Infantino did that was massively important, moving towards this more visual idea that, again, began with Donenfeld as well. For one thing, I just, and I'm saying this as somebody who is not primarily a reader of late Silver Age, early Bronze Age comics. It is amazing to me to read a comic book published in 1966 by DC versus a comic published in 1968 by DC, and visually how different it is. Whereas before you had these very, very small, tight panels overloaded with text. You pick up something like a Batlash story or a Jonah Hex story, and these huge panels, often with no dialogue or narration whatsoever, organically moving across a page, is so powerful and inviting. And it's crazy. Like, if you look at the stuff Kirby was doing at Marvel at the exact same time, Kirby, who was very, very visual, and Marvel was, one of its big things was how much more visual it was in DC. Kirby's still a slave to incredibly tight, generic panels, whereas a lot of the DC artists were beginning to open up and do something that felt so much more natural and so much more inviting, I guess would say. You could just step into a panel and feel a moment, as opposed to watching a plot move by point by point.
Well, and I think that must have reflected the freedom that Infantino realized he had to give to the artists.
Sure.
And it's funny you mentioned that about the tightness of the panels, because it comes to mind that when Kirby came over to do the Fourth World books at DC, I can remember so many issues in which you turned the first page and suddenly you had this enormous double page spread.
Yes.
Every issue.
Kirby.
He did the issue. I loved it.
Yeah, it was unbelievable. It was great. And it was like you're looking at a comic that's 11 by 17, in size, because it was just so huge and so free. Oh, you're right. But look at the people that he got in, and you see why. The people like Wrights, and of course, Adams had been sort of buried at DC. He was doing work for Boltinoff to begin with. I mean, his first work for DC was Bob Hope comic covers.
Didn't he start with Kanigher? Or am I getting that wrong?
What's that?
Didn't Adams start under Kanigher?
Well, he was doing work for Boltinoff to begin with. He did covers for Bob Hope there toward the end of the Bob Hope run. And then it was almost as if Weisinger said, "Oh, that looks interesting." And he did a lot of covers for Action. He got started on World's Finest. He did a couple of stories for World's Finest. He did. He did a couple of. I remember that he did one of the very late Star Spangled War Dinosaur Island stories for Kanigher. That would have been for Kanigher. But no, he started with covers for Boltinoff. He did. Boltinoff did Tomahawk. He did all those great covers for Tomahawk.
Ed, I would give Neil Adams the credit for why the art started getting better, because so when somebody comes in and they're like a tornado, all of a sudden you have to up your game. You have to say, okay, let me see what he's doing. I'm gonna try to do the same. So and plus you're saying Infantino was, he was an art guy, so he could see, okay, this is where we should be going. This is the direction we should be going, and everyone else that came in began to be influenced by him.
Oh, you're so right. I mean, and again, I have to go back to my own experience reading these comics and going to the newsstand and seeing Adams was like, it was like an atomic bomb going off. You looked and you said, "Oh, what is this?" And and eventually making his way into Batman and remaking Batman and so forth, and Green Arrow and all that sort of thing. Like it was a sea change, and you just said to yourself, "Oh my God, this is what they should have been doing these last few years." And it opened up the world of comics like nothing ever had, for me anyway, and I'm sure for other kids who were my age at that time. It was great.
My big takeaway from this episode so far is now I really want to see Neil Adams' work on Bob Hope. I need to see what that looks like.
I think I have an issue, Jeff. I might send it to you.
Please, I would love to see that.
He did the cover. I don't know. He may have done an interior too on the very last issue of Bob Hope, but he did a few of the last few covers of Bob Hope.
I don't got Bob Hope. I think I have an issue he drew of Jerry Lewis. Yeah,
may very well. Yeah, because that was
it's wild. It's wild. And I'll send it to you, man.
it was unbelievable to see him on Batman, and of course, he wasn't going to do every issue, and it was an event when he showed up. and did a Batman story. Because to be honest with you, sometimes you didn't care about the story so much. You're just looking and going, look at that. You're watching Batman go after Two-Face or the Joker or whoever, all these shadows and that sort of thing. But
Beautiful.
it was great stuff. And then you said, oh, this reminds me of the reprints of the 40s Batman that I like to read in the annuals. He was scary, mysterious, et cetera, et cetera. It was great.
And I submit to you that he might be the most imitated artist of all comic books time. I think everybody who grew up wanted to draw like Neil Adams, and
Sure.
they encouraged them to do it.
Yeah, yeah. And you saw a lot of people who were able to ape it a little bit. I mean, didn't Sienkiewicz go through a whole Neil Adams phase?
Yes, he did.
Yeah.
And
For perhaps too long.
No, I like that. Actually, I liked it. I liked that period. I wish he'd stayed there.
No
Yeah.
way.
That's just me.
But I'm glad, we jokingly bring up, doing things for like Bob Hope and for Jerry. Oh my gosh, I'm losing his name now.
Jerry Lewis.
Jerry Lewis. Thank you so much.
The
Freud
darling of
Levin.
France. Don't forget the darling of France. Come on.
But I think it's important because, it's important to remember too that DC at this time period was not just superheroes. And what's cool is you saw vast improvements in artwork across the entire line. When I was looking through just Mike's Amazing World, taking in the issues made during this time period, some of the best covers were done for like girls' love stories.
Oh my gosh.
I'm looking
Yes.
at the cover for Girls Love Stories number 137 right now, made by Rick Estrada. I don't even know who that is.
Hmm.
My God, is that cover incredible? And like, I want to go and buy some of these comics now just because the images are so compelling and make you want to grab and open that book.
Oh, they were great, and they had the great thing was there were so many new opportunities because all these new books were coming out, and I think between 63 and maybe I don't know 1968, DC may have introduced maybe 3 or 4 #1 issues. In other words, new comics, Metal Men, uh, Captain Storm, Scooter, and then so DC, as you guys said, they were just there. They were reliable. They were there. You look at all the numbers of their comics, and with the exception of say Atom, Hawkman, so forth, the ones that had been started in the early '60s, Justice League, all their comics were, many of them were in the triple digits. So they'd been there since dirt was new, and no problem. And then suddenly, every single month, you'd see something new or hear about something new. And as you said, Jeff, they were from a full range. They weren't all just superheroes. And frankly, superheroes were, they were going through one of those phases where they really weren't selling quite so much. Atom and Hawkman, Green Lantern is even canceled, despite the relevancy thing. So, you have three major people in the Justice League who don't even have their own comics. And but you had humor like Angel and the Ape. You had Ditko come back with Creeper and Hawk and the Dove. Enemy Ace gets his own strip.
I actually did the numbers, Ed, and there were over 40 #1 issues or
Wow.
new directions for runs that happened between 68 and 71. Over 40.
40. So when you're a comic fan, you're looking at this and go, this is great. They're experimenting. They're trying something new. It was wonderful. So it was like a smorgasbord.
Yeah.
And especially compared to the way it did. Yeah.
I hate to be that guy, but yeah, they did.
No, you don't. You live for being that guy.
Okay, here it is. My opinion about it is, yeah, they tried a lot of new things, and a lot of those new things failed, and they didn't sell. That's why you only see short runs of Anthro and whatever.
If you look at them, many of them just the plug was pulled. And I don't know, I really don't know to whom you should ascribe that, whether it was Infantino, whether it was the people above Infantino getting cold feet, because it was very interesting. The DC Showcase comic, which was the preview book, Rip Hunter, The Flash, Atom, all these series were previewed for at least 3 issues. And then sometimes they'd take a break and they'd come back for 3 more before they would greenlight a comic book. Well, during this period of time, you have Bing Bang Bang, 3 or 4 showcase issues like Creeper and Anthro getting the green light right away. They went for one issue of Showcase and then suddenly, boom, they're on the stands. There's no way I don't think that they could have seen the sales reports. They just said, let's go with it. And then the flip side of it was that, well, you've got to let a comic build an audience. And I don't think they did. I mean, Bat Lash is probably the best example of one that everyone loved. Everyone loved that. I've never read a bad review of that. That was talk about out of left field. It was great to see a Western comic again, and that artwork was just
Nick Cardy.
wonderful. Yeah, it was wonderful.
You look at the industry today where we have um, Captain America Volume 12, #1. We're constantly pumping out the same old crap over and over again.
Yeah.
I would have loved to have lived in an age where Brother Power the Geek, In the Days of the Mob, Spirit World, Wendy and Willie, Teen Beam, Angel and the Ape, Sinister House of Secret Love, they were trying everything, and it was so cool.
Yeah.
Even if some of it failed, how cool they went for it. And even some of the, we take it for granted now, Dead Man, Hawk and Dove, what weird ideas for the time period. At least it wasn't normal, same old stuff over and over again. They were innovating.
Yeah, and if anything, that was such an impetus to me as a reader to get to the newsstand and see what are they going to do next. What are they going to do next? It's funny.
Not so fast there, Skippy. These books you're saying they were being thrown out. Okay, I get that, but they were failing. But I tell you this: you mentioned Ed. You mentioned something about the Showcase title, and it's funny. I think I remember either hearing or reading an interview it was Infantino or somebody in the know. They said that when Flash was first released, I think in 105, I'm not sure what issue it was, Showcase. They said that they didn't know it was a hit because it was the old time newsstand distribution. So you wouldn't know what sold until maybe 3 to 6 months later.
Yeah.
Right.
So they said that once they got the reports that people were buying a Flash like crazy, that's when they went, okay, let's give him his own book.
Right.
But it was a weird system because you couldn't really know what was selling, and there was a lot of
I was shocked because I knew
activity with the newsstand dealers.
I was shocked when Showcase came out. I think 4 issues in a row. It was Batlash, Anthro, Hawk and the Dove, maybe the 3, and Angel and the Ape, maybe an issue later. But whatever it was, suddenly you turn around the next month, they were on the stands. And I think they were just, I'll tell you another driving force behind a lot of that was with the change in the newsstand distribution, you had to make sure you had a lot of titles out there. So both Marvel and DC, were churning out titles, which I think, again, the law of unintended consequences. They started to put out reprint titles, which many people I know on the boards have commented. I mean, they were a vital part of my becoming a comic book fan because it was like you're getting a history book, so to speak. You say, oh, wow, so this is what it was like in the 40s or 50s. Oh, I've heard of this Justice Society of America, but now they're reprinting a couple of them in an annual. And those were events.
That might have led to the end of Infantino's reign as the top guy. Because they said that he admitted, he said that right before he got, I hope I'm not jumping the order, but right before he got fired, he was called on the carpet. They said, well, why are you releasing so many books out there? We're losing money. They lost $1 million. They said that Marvel at the same time lost $1.5 million. He says, well, Marvel's flooding the market.
Right.
And we have to answer them exactly the way, if they're trying to push us off the stands, we have to come back with just as many books.
Right.
So we could fight them in that sense. He says, well, they didn't agree with that and they let him go.
Mm-hmm.
So
no, that wouldn't surprise me, but it also plays into the fact that, they didn't really have a strategy. They were great. He was great at tactics. Okay, do this, but there was no long range strategy. I'd agree. That's why that's where I think he reached the limits of his talents, being the publisher.
Both companies lost money, so I'm thinking
they did.
Where was this going? Like a fight to the finish, and both end up dead. So I don't know.
There was a real push at the time for the newsstand distributors. Well, they, and the I'm calling them candy stores. The guys at the candy stores who had newsstands. They were also now getting pushed off by a lot of the girly books, which made a lot more money. And if you read some of what they say this is great because I don't have kids hanging around reading the comic books because they can't stay at the adult section of the magazine. I don't need them. And
Problem solved.
yeah, and so all of a sudden, those people wanted the space on the racks, and they're more than happy to give them over if you're the newsstand distributor or the news dealer. So it was. You're right. It was a kind of a dog eat dog situation, but for the fan, at least,
that was the best.
It was just unbelievable.
That was a golden age. You're right. I didn't know Justice Society. I didn't know any of those characters until I opened up a 25-cent a DC book, and the backup was something I never seen before. It was great.
Yeah. I mean, as a kid reading the comics, then I thought that was a great bargain. You knew prices had to go up eventually. But to me, you were getting something for it at least. There were many comics that I bought just for the reprints.
Yeah. It was all new. It was all new to me.
Exactly.
It wasn't like I was getting ripped off.
There was no back issue market back then. There were no trade paperbacks. If you wanted to see where it came from before, reprints were your only opportunity.
The great thing about comics then, even at 25 cents, you weren't spending a huge percentage of whatever you were making by the hour. And you could just say, well, I'll give this a shot. I'll give this one a chance. And I've never read a book about a cave boy, and I've never seen this guy Howie Post. But Anthro was a charming little title. It was great.
Speaking of value, it's actually interesting. Infantino's move to hiring artists as editors and creating these much more visually arranged comic books. I don't know if this was ever an intended consequence, but one thing that happened for sure, George, you and I were discussing in a recent conversation that some of our Patreon extra conversation bits people can see. The idea that when you opened an early 60s comic book, it could take you 30 minutes to read that thing because it was so dense. You had those small panels, all that writing. You got so much story. And you read these comics with these, much more expansive panels and less dialogue, and they read fast, so fast that like you could buy a 15-cent comic before and it would last you a long time. That could occupy an entire afternoon.
Yes.
And these would go by in 15 minutes flat. You need to buy more. So in a way, that might have actually, it should have at least helped DC sales of, wow, I bought 4 books last week and it lasted me 2 hours. I got to buy 8 books this week.
Yeah, I'll tell you.
I didn't see the big thing. They said, well, Marvel's comic books were 20 cents and DC's was 25, and that hurt DC. I'm like, but you did get the extra pages.
Yeah.
It wasn't like it was 20 pages for 25 cents and 20 pages for 20 cents. You were getting like 48 pages and stuff you never seen before. So I thought it was worth it.
Oh, it was great. And as I said, if you're a young comics fan, you couldn't have asked for a better time to be picking up books all over the place.
And once again, those covers, like it almost didn't even matter what was inside. Called to you. It made people who maybe wouldn't have picked up books before want to try them just because they were enticing. And one thing we haven't talked about yet that I think is really important is that Infantino replaced Irish Snap with Gasper Saladino for doing the lettering on the covers. And holy God, did that make a difference?
Yes.
So some of the best title covers logos you'll ever see.
They were great. And Saladino wasn't bad, but even as a casual comics fan or as an uninformed fan, I didn't know who Irish Snap was at that time, but you noticed the drop off immediately. I mean, even the ads that Irish Snap designed and lettered were beautiful. I look forward to seeing the ads for the new comics.
Oh, you were a Snap fan. I'm sorry. I misunderstood that.
Oh, no. I loved him.
Oh, Snap.
Wow. I thought Saladino was so much better.
Oh, no. I thought, to me, I said, oh, we're getting real jazzy and snazzy and modern, and they're trying to, do 60s lettering and so forth. No. No, Secret Six, loved that. Talk about a great cover, by the way. The first Secret Six. How can you resist that if you're a kid?
See, Saladino's the one where like there are times that the title, the logo of it actually makes me pay attention more than the art itself.
I think you're going to have to post some pictures and examples on the forum because I don't know what you guys are talking about. I don't care about the lettering. Give me the art. Who cares about the lettering?
No, logos were big to me, and I even noticed coloring on the logos. Some look better than others.
Yeah.
Some combinations of them,
I tell you what, like again, these books, the younger
I
people
know.
don't realize what it was to grow up in that era because that really kind of was like the golden age. That was the first time they were reprinting books from way back.
Oh, I
Before
mean,
that, they weren't, right? And before the 60s, you never saw
no,
reprints of anything.
the
Maybe
annuals.
in a giant size like Superman, they will give you older stories, but this was like on a regular basis. Every month you
Yes.
open up the back of a book and you go, wow, look at this,
Yeah.
it's
Well, those
nice.
those annual and that's those reprint books were cheap. That was the thing. They didn't pay anybody any rights at that point. So they were just
Yeah,
going back through the files they'd slap on, and they didn't often have to even slap on a new cover.
yeah, that's
They
right. And but Marvel, they were reprinting their whole line that was only not even 10 years old. I actually heard from an interview this morning. He said Infantino said that he had to flood the market because Marvel was doing it. And he says, and if
yes,
he didn't do it, they get pushed out of the
that's
newsstands.
that's right. So, and again, yeah, it cost them money, but it was gonna. I guess they figured this was something they had to do in order to not get swallowed up by
Yeah, that's what they were doing. And I mean, it had to cost because both companies lost money, but I
yeah,
mean, also just comics in general were tanking
yes,
until
yeah,
Star Wars came along. With
right.
Marvel, probably Star Wars, Shooter says it saved Marvel.
And I would assume that for DC and Marvel too, merchandising then became what saved them.
I wonder. I always thought the merchandise had always been around, but just
Not to the
I
extent,
don't know.
but I will say this though, because over the years, every who read Wonder Woman in the 1960s? I certainly didn't. I might pick up an occasional issue just if I had 12 cents lying around, but really, it had no
Yeah,
interest for me whatsoever. It was always crazy and poorly done. But they published it year after year because they did not want to lose the rights to it. And they were merchandising, not to the extent that they are today, but for instance, they had the Superman TV show, they had the Superman Ben Cooper Halloween costume or whatever, and Wonder Woman as well. So they lost money on the book itself, but the
mm.
contracts for the merchandising,
Infantino said that these comic books weren't making any money at all. That's why the newsstands didn't really like them.
right, right,
He said, like you said, the girly mags were
yeah,
the money makers.
yeah,
But I mean, how much? What's the price point? I mean, 12 cents. I mean, how
I
much are
know.
you really making?
Oh,
How you paying people for 12
if you're
cents a
making a
book?
penny. And plus, remember, even then, the newsstand guys were ripping them off because
Yeah.
remember you could send back just the top part of the cover. You could send back the logo. And I
Hmm.
can remember as a kid at flea markets and there would be at one of the candy stores where I used to go, Maxie's. Maxie would have a few of them that were torn. You get them for a nickel. So
Oh
Maxie had
yeah.
gotten Maxie had sent them back, say, "Oh, didn't sell this one until I will."
Yeah, it was a ripoff. Of course,
So
they're honest.
it was very sketchy. And as I said, the mob was involved in a lot of this newsstand stuff. Kinney was supposedly a mob company. So, you weren't exactly dealing with Norman Vincent
Yeah.
Peale or somebody like that.
But you don't even have to be a mob member just to take advantage of somebody on the
Oh,
honor
no,
system. Because it
no.
really was the honor system.
Oh, without a doubt.
You guys haven't mentioned the biggest development, him bringing Jack Kirby into DC. What do you say about that, Ed?
I loved it, of course. As a kid, I thought, this was the biggest news I'd ever seen. This was like, I don't know, the Yankees. Well, I'm actually going to the real world. The Red Sox selling Babe Ruth.
It's like the Yankees getting Reggie Jackson.
Yeah,
That's what
yeah.
it
It was
was. It
it,
was like, holy
this
crap.
this shook the whole thing apart because you just took for granted that Kirby was over there, and then suddenly he's coming to this side of the street. You didn't know what he was going to do, and the fact that he wound up on Jimmy Olsen. Holy crow! I don't even think Jimmy Olsen's mother bought Jimmy Olsen. And suddenly and again I said it before, you open those pages and you just, wow, it's like you're walloped. I loved all those
Yeah.
books. I didn't always know where the hell they were going, but it was so different and unique. And
The writing was a weak point, but it was just so amazing visually. Well, I'm not gonna say who he needed, but the
no,
the last name rhymes with B. But the concepts are great. This the whole this dark side thing and Mr. Miracle, all that stuff. Commandy. I mean, I know Commandy was a ripoff of Planet of the Apes, but still,
Well,
we went along with it.
Actually, the original concept for Commandy began before Planet of the Apes even happened. It was just then Kirby went back to when he went to DC. But I would say, like, in terms of the writing, though, and it's dangerous lumping Kirby into any category. I recognize that. But I would say that I think one thing that happened under Infantino at DC, at least with the stronger artists and the stronger artistic editors, was that a lot of times the writing actually didn't matter. And I say this as somebody who loves writing first and foremost. As a comic fan, sometimes the images and the basic plot told enough of the story that you can just stop reading the words and scan the pages and know exactly what's happening anyway. And it never really bothered me that Kirby's actual, scripting wasn't the strongest, because man, do those images tell stories, and his plots were so out there and so incredible that it didn't matter to me.
No, and I have to agree with you, because I never, maybe a couple of times you'd stop, you go back and read something, you say, really, did someone actually say that? But they were just like action movies before there really were action movies.
Yes.
And so, you're just looking and the poses and the concepts and the costumes and those, as I said before, those 2-page spreads just kill you. It was just great. I can remember buying New Gods 1 and saying, oh man, this is going to be here for a long time, I hope.
It was fantastic stuff. But he did need help with the dialogue. Some of that dialogue was pretty painful. Come on.
Yeah, I know. But you know what?
He's a legend. He's the best. I'm just saying. But some of the dialogue was like,
no, but you gotta give the guy some leeway, so to speak, because you're opening a book and you say, "There's more in this comic book than I've read in a full run of some other stuff."
Let me ask you this then: do you really think his books failed, or what? Because there's some rumor that because of the distribution shenanigans, nobody really knew if those books were succeeding or not. But I know that was the biggest thing, like in DC. So that the idea that they were like not selling.
It was a mystery to me as a reader, because it seemed like they were just moving along and that he was just in charge and in control, and DC was pushing the hell out of him. And then it was as if they were just pushed off to the side and disappeared. I think the Demon and Commandi probably lasted longest, and the Demon didn't. I think a few other people actually finished up Commandi. They had other artists on it.
Yeah. After issue 33, somebody else took over. It lasted until issue 59.
And then it was like I always felt I felt terrible about it, to be honest with you. I mean, I empathized with Kirby. I said, now he's got to sort of go back to Marvel. And what's he going to do there? And I honestly, to be honest, I never really followed his work at Marvel after that. I know a lot of folks have read it and like it, but it just didn't it didn't compel me to go over there and read that. I felt terrible, because I thought I was getting cheated as a reader, and you knew that and you're getting and a few years later, they're going to bring them back with somebody else doing it. And
well, it's funny. I did hear that when Kirby first introduced those characters, he intended for in other words, he'll do the first 6 issues, and then somebody else will take over. He didn't. The plan wasn't for him to do every single book, every part of every single book, and that's what they ended up doing. But they were all started bi-monthly, so one book would be this month, the next book would be the next month. But I think he intended for other people to take over once he introduced the concepts. I don't know if he got lied to, because I mean he became disillusioned after a while, and that's why he came back to Marvel.
I can't imagine anybody in the comic book business lying to an employee.
That never happens.
No.
Part of the problem.
Put that from your head.
Part of the problem too that might help to explain why Kirby was essentially shown the door is, as much as we give Infantino credit for trying to age up the target demographic, looking at older people, we do have actual quotes from him from a New York Times Magazine article he did, that in 1971, essentially, the way that he was measuring whether or not his books were working was he was interviewing groups of kids around the country. And he doesn't say what age group he means by that, but when we're talking kids, I would imagine the Kirbyverse was aimed more at, your college age people, folks who had grown up on the early Marvel, had gotten older, and were looking for something bigger. And if you're asking, 10 and 12-year-olds, what do you think of Commandi? They might just be like, what the frick is that? That's not Batman.
Yeah. Real sophisticated demographic study.
Right, exactly. I mean, that was the best they had at that point beyond gorilla covers. But if all you're looking for is what kids think, then a comic that's not targeted towards kids is going to fail in your eyes.
Yeah.
It might have been something just as simple as money. Maybe they were just paying them too much. And they said, look, we're losing money anyway. Let's just cut them loose.
Well, I'm sure it was expensive to bring him over and to keep him. No doubt about that.
People paint Kirby as such the victim. But I submit to you, he had to have been the highest paid artist year after year.
That might have been it also. Maybe the other artists were jealous or something like that. It might have been a work culture issue.
He's the top player. You're paying him the top.
It might have even been as simple as the fact that if you look at we haven't even talked yet about the fact that Infantino ordered basically the complete resets, thematically at least, on all the major characters, Wonder Woman, Superman, Batman. Those were all moves towards being more realistic. Actually, I have a quote from Infantino. This is again from that New York Times Magazine, May 1971 interview. He says, the push for relevance was a last-ditch effort at keeping the superhero alive. Green Lantern was dying, he said. The whole superhero line was dying. We started interviewing groups of kids around the country, and the one thing they kept repeating, they wanted to know the truth. Suddenly the light bulb goes on. So Superman gets significantly depowered. Wonder Woman gets depowered. Batman gets more street level. And then you've got Kirby, who's on this whole other plane of imaginative existence. And it just might have been like, this does not fit what we're going for anymore.
It's sad, really, because the whole, to me anyway, one of the benefits of this time that Infantino, quote unquote, took over was that you had all kinds of experimentation being done. In other words, if you were a DC reader, you didn't have to necessarily enjoy their whole line. You could pick and choose, and there was stuff you liked for you, and there was stuff that your friend liked. And so the fact that Kirby was on a whole different plane, to me anyway, as a reader, was great. That was fine. That was great for me.
They had more experimentation and more titles coming out of everywhere and everything to choose from. If you didn't want to read Justice League, you could read Swamp Thing, or you could read House of Mystery or whatever, or Jerry Lewis or whatever was happening out there, You didn't have to buy the whole line.
To me, that those years are as close as what the 1940s must have been like. When you see those pictures of old newsstands with dozens and dozens of comic books, all different genres, and you just say, wow, that must have been great. And this is as close as it ever came, at least for me. I never saw such. Now, again, today there must be a great deal of variety, and I'm taking myself out of that part of the discussion because I don't buy, I don't go, I don't follow it. But and even if I did, they'd all cost close to $10 anyway. So,
Rich, you're not missing anything. The comic books these days are all rehashing all old plot lines. It's
well, the DC and Marvel comics are not all comics, just DC and Marvel.
The big two. They won't take a chance. Everything is a brand new. Galactus is attacking Earth for the 89th time. You're getting the same stuff over and over again.
And that's where DC was in 1966 as well. And I think that, there's Infantino for you. If he was nothing else, he broke up the logjam. Even just like, when he appointed all these artists as editors, he was breaking up the existing fiefdoms. And like, for example, I don't know if there was ever an intentional agenda behind it, but like, your mainstay writers like Bill Finger, Otto Binder, and Gardner Fox, you just don't see them getting gigs anymore once this happens. It's new voices and new approaches. And what had been done forever and ever and ever naturally goes away because there's new, younger, energetic voices directing where DC's going.
And remember, too, those were the guys who were kind of being, quote unquote, militant and saying, we'd like a little bit more protection and maybe a higher rate. I think they were starting to ask about retaining some of the rights to their material. But they wanted a health plan and so forth. And that was going nowhere. And so those guys, they were all gone. And you're right. They were replaced by Gardner Fox. I think his last story for Justice League was about 65 or 66 in the run. He had done the whole thing. And then suddenly it was Denny O'Neil.
And I'm never going to feel great about Bill Finger being shown the door. That's never going to sit exactly right with me. But, at the same time, new voices, new energy, new directions, that at least is a positive thing.
Yeah. And who knows that those guys couldn't have benefited from a different kind of editor than they were used to, an editor with an artistic side to his approach, so that because I think a lot of cases they were just said, "Yep, turn in another story. You know the formula, you know the routine," and that's what they did. Because DC was satisfied with pretty much the whatever you want to call it, run of the mill, the usual, what's been selling. Don't tip over the apple cart, so to speak.
And I think to be fair too, I think Donenfeld was beginning to implement a lot of change himself. I think some things that continued under Infantino's watch. I know, for example, like we haven't talked yet about the infamous Teen Titans number 20, with Wolfman and Wine involved in that one. Ween, I keep calling him Wine. But that was Donenfeld pushing for that. Push the edge, push the boundaries, go somewhere new, shake things up. I can't help but wonder if he would have changed Wonder Woman and Batman and Superman too. And we know that he was emphasizing covers and looking for art being more important. And
Sure.
It's possible.
I mean, if he had stayed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Certainly that. In Infantino, when in his interviews, he's always like, it wasn't like he had this brilliant, passionate climb to become, artistic editor and then editor, in publisher. He's always sort of like, then they offered me this, and I was like, sure. Then they offered me this, and I was like, okay. Then they said, do this, and I said, fine. It was kind of like Donenfeld laid it out for him, and Infantino just sort of took it to the next logical level and had great people who came in under him.
Jeff, Teen Titans 20, what happened in that book? You act like we should know what that book is.
Oh, let's do it. Okay. So Teen Titans number 20 was the storyline where this is Marv Wolfman and Len Wein had just taken over the book. They just pried it away from Bob Haney after it had gotten very repetitive and dry. And they were going to introduce DC's first black superhero. And essentially what it was there was a black gang of teens who was being coerced by some white guy to use their rage for criminal purposes. And this hero, who was masked for most of the issue, was trying to convince these black kids that their anger was being misdirected and that the man was against them, that they needed to realize what was really happening. And he was going to unmask at the end and be this, black guy. It was going to be this huge deal. And Donenfeld approved it. It was all set to go. They wrote it. Cardi penciled it. It was inked. And that was right when Infantino took over and Donenfeld left. And Infantino takes one look at the finished product and goes, this is crap. We're not publishing this. And just tosses it away. And there's conflicting information on what happened and why that occurred. I think it's Len Wein who claimed that Infantino had said this will never play in the South. Whereas Infantino said it was just a crappy story. And Wolfman concedes it was a crappy story. But they also said that Donenfeld had said, keep pushing, this is great. We need this, change it up. And so at least there was an attempt to be progressive and more real and to break the mold before Infantino was even in charge.
And Infantino got cold feet.
Yeah, and the real sad byproduct of that is not that the story was canceled. And by the way, it was Neil Adams did a late night, all night long rewrite to make that story finally able to go to press with Cardi's art. And it's a terrible story what finally got printed.
Maybe it's just a different time. He was afraid, the society wasn't ready for it yet.
Well, sure. And you know what? And honestly, even if his logic really had been it won't play in the South, while that's sad and unfortunate and a little cowardly, that's not the real tragedy. What bothers me is Wolfman and Wein were blacklisted afterwards. They could not work for DC after that.
They did come back to DC and contribute a lot of good things.
Right.
Sure. After they'd proven themselves at Marvel and become, very attractive talent there. Sure.
Did they go right over to Marvel and were hired pretty quickly? Do you know?
There was an in-between phase, and what actually happened, God, I'm going to forget the name. Whoever was editing Teen Titans at the time, I'm blanking on who that was.
It wasn't still George Cashton, was it?
No, it was not. He was in California at that point, working on animation.
Oh, I think Giordano eventually had it, right?
It was Giordano, thank you. And what Giordano was doing was he was quietly hiring them on the side to be consultants on stories. So, like, for example, when you get Wonder Girl's origin, that came from Wolfman and Wein, but we didn't really hire them. They were getting bits and pieces and scraps here and there until they were finally able to make the move over to Marvel.
Interesting.
So I think we've already covered the price war that happened with Marvel and jumping to 25 cents and how that ultimately bit them in the butt. And we talked a bit about Infantino getting fired. What's left in Infantino's legacy that we need to discuss?
I would just submit that that was, and it wasn't just Infantino, but the whole industry was changing. But he was certainly a driver at DC. If I'm not going to get into when the Bronze Age began or whatever, but certainly more realism in comics. The whole horror phase that came in 70, 71 because they relaxed the comics code.
Mm-hmm.
And so and everything seemed to be horror at that time. Everything was weird Western, weird war.
Yeah, we did a podcast about that, and I think like 20 people listened to it. That's not bad.
21. Thank you. And
I loved how they moved. They started blending genres too. You had in addition to all their straight horror titles, you also had weird war stories, weird Western tales, Sinister House of Secret Love, Dark Mansion of Forbidden Love. They blended horror with everything else. It was amazing.
Yeah, they did. And of course, horror, it was like George was saying about Superman being on the cover. Horror made it into even the superhero titles.
Teen Titans.
Yeah.
That was a great one.
Flash had ghosts on the cover and so forth. So, but I also think that well, of course, we said it. There were so many new talented people who came in who were comics fans to begin with, and for the most part, I think that was a benefit for the industry and for comics.
Sure.
Which and as you said previously, I guess to a certain extent, some of the early Golden Age guys grew up reading comics or were very young when they got into comics and had been reading them for a couple of years. But the Roy Thomases and the Wolfmans and the Weens and people like that, they had grown up reading comics from DC and Marvel both. And now suddenly they had their chance to get into the toy room and play with them a little bit.
And I think George made the point earlier that most of what happened under Infantino ultimately got undone. That it was an experiment that didn't last.
Mm-hmm.
But at least bringing in some of that new talent and new voices and bringing in some new readers, DC ends up having the implosion, only shortly after all this. But as we acknowledge, this was such a creative time where so many new things were changed and tried that had never been done before, and that we're seeing a lot less experimentation today. If you could take any one specific property or idea or concept from Infantino's time and bring it into modern day comics, other than just expand the line in general, which is, a very general concept, is there one title or one concept or one move he made that you'd like to see happen again in comics today?
I certainly have a soft spot for Bat Lash, but that may also be because I love Westerns.
But that was actually where I was going to go to. It was that George and I were recently lamenting, again, in one of our conversations that'll be available to Patreon soon, that it's sad that superheroes have become synonymous with the comic book industry. And that, I love that DC wasn't just doing Westerns. They were doing Westerns with a twist. Jonah Hex was such an anti-hero. He was so alive. It almost didn't matter what genre he was in. And Batlash was just such a grinning son of a bitch. They were so fun and so different from what had been done before. And I never read Firehair. I need to check that one out. But that
it was just Kubert did it 3 issues in Showcase, and then it popped up occasionally just randomly, and it's too bad because that was in a sense ahead of its time too.
Yeah, but doing Westerns and not just repeating what had been done, but taking them in new directions.
Yeah.
I would love to see them do that again.
Yeah, I would love to see a Batlash. I'll tell you what I think would be it unfortunately folded the tent under Infantino, but Dick Giordano took it out with a flair, so to speak, and that was the Blackhawk series. I mean, that had been printed since like 41 in one title or another, and it was doomed. They went through that junk heap heroes period, and it was just horrible and stupid. It outlived itself. But then there were 2 more issues that had to be done, and Giordano brought in Wolfman, and he found it. That's the story. He found a script in the desk of George Cashton that Wolfman had written as a kid, young guy, and they refashioned it. They used his idea. I forget now. It might have even been Haney. I'm not sure. Don't quote me on that. But Pat Boyette did the last couple of issues, which brought back the Black Knights, brought back Nazis. They were just two really well-told stories. Like you're reading these as a kid, you're saying this is like reading a great story. And there's always been rumors that Spielberg was going to bring back a Black Hawk movie, but they've amounted to nothing. But I would have loved to have seen that continue in that Black Knights phase under Infantino. But Batlash, definitely, definitely. And I wonder if something silly like Inferior 5 would work as a television show today, mocking all these superheroes.
That was a fun book.
It was very clever.
I don't know if this is Infantino's era, but I like Angel and the Ape also.
Is that what you bring back, George?
No, actually, the book I really like, and it's a guilty pleasure, and I like it for all the wrong reasons, is the Wonder Woman run where she was like Diana Rigg.
Oh, the I Ching thing? Yeah.
Yeah, she lost the powers. She became a kung fu expert in 20 minutes. And then fought crime. Was the best. And I tell you, Sikowski did a nice job with that art.
Isn't that something? Yeah, he was perfectly suited for that.
I love that run. I actually bought the reprints of that.
Yeah, that's a good one too. That would have made a great series or a great movie.
Yeah, and I got to say too, I would love to have seen where the hell Brother Power the Geek would have gone. Reading 2 issues
That's
it was not
I'm
enough.
taking my headphones off right now.
that series, like across 2 issues and like 4 stories, changed so many times. I had no idea where it was headed.
That was, first of all, I loved it, and I finally found a copy of number 2 and read it. And no one else has a copy of number 3 except me and Dan Bailey. But it always seemed to me, looking back on it when I was older, that it should have been narrated by Jack Webb. It was like the Dragnet version of hippiedom. It was just so weird, and there's got to be room for that kind of weirdness.
Yes,
it was just so, and that would make a great show today or a great movie.
Oh my, it would be great as a really dark and twisted version of it.
Yeah.
I think that would sell.
I'm not sure you guys know what the definition of great is because, huh?
We're talking about possibility here, George. Possibility.
So, here's the one thing I can't figure out with all the expanding of into different genres that they did under Infantino.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they even did the Three Musketeers, trying funny animals out one more time. How the hell did it take them until 1973 to hit Sword and Sorcery?
Well, they were behind the 8 ball because it was Roy Thomas who brought Conan out in 70 after much persuading of Stan Lee, and then suddenly the sword hit the fan and they went, and that Sword of Sorcery they had some great covers on that, and it was again aborted, so to speak. It was just and then Chaykin did Iron Wolf, which was similar in some ways to the Sword and Sorcery. Great stuff, but yeah, they never went anywhere. Then they tried to do Beowulf.
Yeah.
After Infantino, or maybe at the very end, and that was really that didn't really go anywhere.
Well, they had a title that I kind of liked. It was called Starfire. It was a woman set in a Sword and Sorcery, but also set like in space, I think.
Yes,
I'm not sure. It was wild, but I like that book.
That was probably a victim of the DC implosion in '78, if I'm not mistaken.
A lot of things got canceled.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But yeah, Secret Six was another one that was fun. That could have been a good one.
I like the revival they did during Action Comics Weekly in the 80s.
Was it good?
It was
enjoyable.
By Action Comics Weekly standards, it was very good. If that means anything.
Oh, I have to stand corrected. DC did do a Sword and Sorcery roughly around the same time that Bernie Wrightson and Grandinetti, he did some of the art on the Nightmaster strip in Showcase.
Oh, when was that?
That was in the the 80s, if you will, numbering Showcase. And it was his name. He was a rock musician, I think, and his name was Jim Rook. And he's more or less transported somehow to another dimension. and he had to become a sword and sorcery kind of a hero. And Wrightson did, oh, my memory, I think he did the cover. No, maybe Kubert did a couple of the covers too, but Wrightson and Grandinetti did the art on those stories. And again, it was one of those things where you said, let's go, let's do this some more. It never went anywhere else, though, unfortunately.
That's fascinating, because around the same time, Warren had a property called The Rook.
Right.
Who was a guy who traveled through time.
Yeah. That may have been a little nod to him. That came out a few years later. You're right.
I didn't even realize that.
Yeah. Yeah.
George, what were you saying?
I was going to say that I always thought the answer to Conan that really stuck that DC had was Warlord.
Yeah.
I know that came a little later. That might have been the beginning of the 80s. I'm not really sure. But I know that book was that was quite a good book.
It had a long run.
Yeah, I would just imagine why it took them so long when Conan was selling so well right out the gate, that it took them so long to adapt. Last thing I don't understand, because DC got really into fighting Marvel on the larger size books. They did their Treasury editions, they did their 100-pagers, they did their Superman and Batman family books. Yet when Marvel was putting out the Curtis magazines left and right, DC had Spirit World and the Days of the Mob, and that was it.
Yeah, and they were both Kirby projects. So
right. And I know that Kirby was asked to do that specifically to take up that space in the racks, but where was DC's magazine game beyond that?
Yeah, nowhere. Marvel did pretty well with those, I would think. They had a ton of those titles, didn't they?
And it was some of their best stuff, too. Honestly, Marvel magazines in the early 70s is some of their best writing and some of their best art.
Yeah, yeah. I used to always pick those up, as a matter of fact. And, because they were on the magazine rack and they cost more, it was a little bit better split with the dealer and distributor. And, technically.
Yeah, but also, remember, you could see boobies if you open those books.
I was going to say, maybe it goes back to your point earlier about how the girly mags were more desirable to the store owners.
That's right. That's exactly
why fill that with Marvel and DC magazines? Maybe they saw it as futile.
Well, and Marvel made the first step into that market to begin with what was it called? I don't know. Was it called the Spider-Man Spectacular or the
Spectacular Spider-Man?
Spectacular Spider-Man.
Yep.
And that was 2 issues. And I can remember when that came out. That was in the summer around this time. Was it 68-ish, 67, something like that? Oh, that was a big deal. We all wanted that. It was 35.
And I heard that it sold, but the people thought it didn't. Again, the newsstand thinking the money, the stats came out later, and it turns out it was a tremendous big hit.
Yeah.
And they blew it. They could have kept it going, but
Yeah.
It's what happens.
Like so many of these, you wonder, how do these industries survive when so much of the information they get, or they couldn't get the information, and the information they get is confusing or late or not definitive.
It's by interviewing adolescents around the country.
What's that?
Right. Here's some candy. What do you think about Green Lantern?
If you say yes, you get 2 pieces. You can say no, you get 1. But even today, the system is direct market. You send it to the comic shop, but even that's a gamble, because let's say something comes out, the person that runs the comic shop is going to order, let's say 100,000, but he doesn't know if the 100,000 are going to sell.
No.
So maybe the next one, they usually cut it by 50% to the second issue. So that's a gamble.
Which is why there are long boxes full of damage control comics for a nickel, right?
It also brings us back to the point that we have an industry today that is far more concerned with trying to tell people what they want than by trying to anticipate what they want. And whether or not that's working is certainly debatable. But that's what was so special about this time period, was watching DC and Marvel flailing around trying everything to make the readers happy. And it's such a treat.
It really was. And again, experiencing it when Marvel expanded the line and they had more titles coming out, the distribution improved, and that opened up another whole world to me as a comics reader. And I was crazy about that too. It was wonderful to see them all, and you get reintroduced to it, or introduced to it, and it was a lot of fun to be a comics reader in those years.
Absolutely.
So what are you saying? It's not fun now?
It's not.
You don't want to buy You don't want to buy another variant cover?
Yeah, yeah. I'm haunting the newsstand now, looking for Anthro number 8. So if you'd see it anyway,
It's gonna be a while, man.
If,
Sorry.
if only DC would reset their universe and start from scratch, that certainly would fix everything.
Yes.
that. Well, wait a minute. Give me an hour.
It's right. It's right next to that the Brother Geek number 3 that you're looking for.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we should probably wrap up here, I'm thinking, gentlemen. Does that work for you guys?
It does indeed.
Did we cover everything?
I think we did. Is there anything
in the 3 hours we've been here?
Oh my
you
God.
get good friends together, it's going to happen. But Ed, thank you so much for joining us today.
Right, man.
Well, I really do. I do want to thank you, Ed, because it was really cool going down to an area that George and I had less experience in, and I got exposed to a lot of cool stuff preparing for this. I'd never actually read Batlash before. I'd never read Jonah Hex before. And
You're kidding.
Yeah, it was, what can I say? This was an amazing morning for me today. I woke up at 6 and just started reading, and I was so pumped to talk about this by 1 o'clock.
That's good. That's good. Well, thank you for the chance. I don't know how much I was able to bring to it except fond memories, but your recall for information.
That's half the battle. Are you kidding me?
That's what we're here for. Fond memories, man. And we're going to have to get you back on here again too, because it really was a pleasure talking to you today.
Oh, thank you so much. It was really a pleasure to be on.
The CCF In Depth theme song is written, produced, and performed by Paul King. Thanks to Scott Harris King, no relation, who created the original Classic Comics Forum podcast. A huge, massive, super thank you to our Patreon supporters, including Bill Sinclair, Marty Golia, Michael Gallagher, Paolo Zakedu, Tim Schneider, and Berkeley. You are our shining knights in armor who keep us going and keep our morale up as well. Thanks for sticking with us through all of the ridiculous shenanigans that we pull. Speaking of ridiculous shenanigans, my gosh, if you're looking for more CCF In Depth content, have you yet wandered over to patreon.com, where you can get access to the hidden, secret, holy Jesus, ridiculous stuff that we have there waiting for you, including George and I singing a karaoke version of arguably the worst incarnation of I've Got You Babe ever published to the internet. It's a true exercise in pain, both existential and physical, to listen to. But on top of that, we just started our new series, Off the Cuff, available exclusively to our Patreon members. We just did 2 episodes on Neil Adams and Vince Colletta, where if you've ever wanted to hear the behind-the-scenes stories about Vince Colletta in strip clubs, or Neil Adams making people who work for him cry at conventions, you might want to check those out. We have 2 more in the pipelines that'll be being published in the next 2 weeks. So this is a great way to get a lot of extra content, as well as help ensure that the CCF and the CCF In Depth will be around for many, many years to come. So please check it out at patreon.com/the Classic Comics Forum. CCF In Depth is produced in partnership with the Classic Comics Forum, the friendliest group of knowledgeable geeks you'll ever find on the internet. Come visit us at classiccomics.org or find us on Facebook, and we'll see you next month.
Classic Comics, the Classic Comics Forum in depth, snappy conversations with your hosts George and Jeff. Oh, Classic Comics, the Classic Comics Forum in depth, talking about old comic books is the thing that they love the best. Get your hands off my comic books.
ClassicComics.org